This live stream is part of my It's Who You Know monthly series, an opportunity for me to introduce you to some really awesome people I know that I think you should know too. Most of you will probably be aware I wrote a best-selling book all around the power of connection. I know that the people you know are the game changer between you staying where you're at and where it is that you need to go. A couple of little bits and pieces. If you're watching this across on the tubes over on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to our channel over there on YouTube. You'll see there's a little bell there. Click that button because we're constantly loading up videos there and we love to connect with you there. The other place you can find me is over at our Facebook group, the Be Brilliant Networking Lounge. This is a place where incredible business people connect, they network, they collaborate, and we learn how to absolutely elevate our businesses from where they're at now to where they want to go. So let's just crack on with it. Oh, by the way, wherever you're listening, make sure you say hi, introduce yourself. I've got that chat open. And if you're watching on replay, just type replay in the comments box so that I know that you watched it on replay. If you have any questions on replay, still put those there in the comments box because I'll absolutely make sure to respond. Now, enough of that. Time for me to have a quick swig of my tea before I introduce my very good friend, the incredible, the inspiring Shane Hatton. So Shane, I have known for quite a few years actually. And every single time I chat to Shane, one, we have the best conversations that trigger off even more ideas in my mind. But also this guy's brain and how he thinks is insane. And the work that he's doing in the leadership space is really, really inspiring in terms of the work that he's doing to try and make sure that there's that exponential change happening in leadership. Some of you might have heard my story about my massive panic attack when I went to market with launching Be Brilliant. And I share the story about one person that literally called me on my own BS and said, Janine, you need to use your own IP. Well, this is him. This is Shane Hatton. So we are just having a chat today. I want you to see the genius this guy has. I want you to know him too. So Shane, say hi.
Oh, Janine, you know, when you were talking about before all the subscription ways and ways to subscribe, I was sitting here thinking while you were saying that, I feel so privileged to be subscribed to your life. And so like the ability to have you as one of those people in my circle, it's a subscription that I would never unsubscribe from. It's such a valuable one.
Oh, you are just gorgeous. Seriously, you didn't need to say that, but thank you.
Yeah. And the conversation goes both ways. I love chatting with you as well because I feel like it's nice to be able to have conversations with people who, again, help you think bigger and can kind of bounce back your own ideas. So I feel like you're one of those people as well to have the great conversation with.
Well, that's the power of connection, right? Talking connection, I want to give a big high five shout out to Arthur, who's joining us over in South Africa. Hey, Arthur. I know Arthur's been following my work for a while. Wonderful to see you online. If you've got any chat questions, make sure you fire away. Anyone else dialing in through LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, just stick your comments, questions there, and I will make sure to keep my eye on the chat so we can, I can try and get Shane to answer those for you. So Shane, I know you, but the people watching this, some may, some won't. Oh, Shrimi's joined us too. Shrimi's saying Janine is an amazing connector. Thank you, Shrimi. Shane, tell the people watching, my awesome friends online, what it is that you do.
Well, I would describe myself as Queenslander by birth, Melburnian by choice. I would say I'm curious in nature and creative at heart. That would be kind of the description of me as a person. And what I do is essentially I work with organizations to help their executive leaders be more strategic and less transactional. I do that by helping their people leaders be remarkable at what they do. So it helps them kind of fill their internal pipeline with great leaders and also helps them get out of the detail and more into the big picture.
And I think that's probably where our initial connection happened. Your angle of remarkable leaders, my passion about unleashing brilliance. There's this wonderful connect there of how together we're both trying to help other people become the best version of themselves. And I loved your point right at the beginning of this chat, where you actually talked to the value of the connection and how when we actually connect properly, remarkable things happen. It's like this spark of ideas. We spoke recently and you said something about, Janine, I make a point of every time I connect being very intentional about the connection. And you mentioned that there's three almost views that you make that connection through. Can you share that for us?
I think every conversation or room that I walk into, I try to adopt, I guess, a persona or an attitude in kind of three different ways. And I would say every room or every conversation I go in through the lens of a student. And the question I'm constantly asking myself is, what could I learn from this conversation or from this room? And that started predominantly because I am generally the kind of person who would sit in the corner of a conference or a networking event, or, and I would kind of stick to myself and I wouldn't meet people. And as someone who's high learner on their Clifton strengths, I realized that the way that I could combat that shyness or that fear of speaking to people was to go in as the attitude of a learner. So I go into the room now not thinking about who could I meet. I go into the room asking myself the question of what could I learn? And I think that's helpful to be able to meet people and build connections. But then I realized that I actually have a perspective that I can bring to the room. And there's actually something that I can contribute. And every room I was going to, it felt like I was just pulling from the room. And I thought, what could I do to give back to the room? So the second kind of persona I adopt is as a mentor, which is what can I contribute into this conversation, or what could I contribute in this room from my perspective and from my learning? And then the last kind of persona that I go in with is the perspective and the persona of a teacher, which is, what do I take from this conversation, or what do I take from this room, and what do I do to share that with other people? And if I was to go away and relay this lesson to somebody else, or this learning to somebody else, how would I teach it? And I guess it helps me to simplify all of the lessons and distill it down into something that's helpful for other people. So now those are the three times I go in. I go, be a student, be a mentor, be a teacher in every conversation or room that you walk into.
I love that. Can you give a recent example of when you've done that? And I'm curious, the people that are listening and watching this live, that concept of every conversation you have, every connection you have, I wonder how it would change and be different if you entered that conversation as a student, curious about something to learn, as a mentor, curious about how you can add to the conversation, which I think that's what I'm almost doing now, and a teacher in terms of what you can take and pass on. So those of you that are listening, I would love to know your thoughts on that. Shane, give us an example of where you've done that recently.
Yeah, I mean, the most recent example that comes to my mind is that we had a conference a couple of weeks ago online with the IABC, which is a business communicators conference. And when we were in the room, the conference was kind of flipped in the sense that it wasn't just about speakers to audience. It was about practitioners and professionals talking to one another at round tables. And I remember coming into the table and sitting there and thinking to myself, if I was a student of these exceptionally talented people, what could they teach me, or what could I learn from them? And so the attitude that I have is one of pure curiosity. And I go into the conversation going, what are the questions that I could ask that would bring out the best of other people, rather than what's the ideas that I can have that could contribute to the conversation. And so what I did is I would jump from table to table and I'd have conversation after conversation. And I would be kind of gathering these, little pieces of information and gathering them all in different conversations. And then there was a point where when you do that often enough, you're speaking with other people and you go, I just heard something that was really valuable in that space or within that conversation that could contribute to this table or could contribute to this conversation. So what you do is you reach into that little bag that you've gathered and you share that with other people. And then you attribute it with honor to the people that you kind of brought those lessons from. And doing so, you kind of contribute, but you also teach at the same time. So it's not necessarily something that has to be dramatically difficult. It's just purely through the lens of curiosity and learning and sharing.
And intentionality, I think.
Huge intentionality.
I think there's an element of intentionality around that, of this moment that I am connecting with this particular human being matters. And therefore, I am going to be intentional around how I connect, how I am present, how I am curious, how I'm going to take this moment and do something with it. And I think we see across all walks of life, not just leadership, but across all walks of life, this lack of intention about each of those connection points. Would you agree?
Well, have you seen that? I mean, have you ever been in a room and like you've been to a lot of conferences, you speak at a lot of conferences, you've been to a lot of events. Have you ever had one of those conversations where you're in the conversation with a person, but their eyes are over your shoulder?
Yes.
And,
oh my God.
and that feeling that you get on the inside that the person's not really present with you because they're maybe waiting for someone more important to walk into the room. And I think people are intentional about that, looking for the most important person in the room that they could learn from. But I wonder what you might learn if you just remained a little bit more present in the conversation for someone who you feel like maybe at the time has nothing to add. Those are the people I think have the most to teach us.
Yeah, I think that's right. So there's a reason for this, and therefore it's our job to try and create the space to help that opportunity get developed and get anchored. It reminds me of, you wrote something recently, you posted something on one of the social channels, which, by the way, I love your social presence. It's
thank you.
Just love the artistry that you put into your posts, unlike my crazy ones. But you were talking about this, where ideas come from. And you were talking about the connection piece between almost like the curiosity and creation of ideas, how you then collaborate, but then also how you turn it into something else. Can you just add your, I know I've probably preceded that totally wrongly, but yeah, talk to me about, because you've got this big thing about idea creation, which as leaders and as business owners, it's one of the critical things that we've got to do. We can either sit still and keep doing the same old thing and then wonder why other people are jumping ahead of us in our careers or stealing our share of the business, or we can be constantly curious about, how do I find the next thing? So talk to me about your thinking on this.
Yeah, I think for me, ideation comes really naturally. So my number one theme in Clifton Strengths is ideation. And when people describe that to me, it's obviously about coming up with ideas, and they say, oh, well, you've got ideation, so you can come up with ideas and I can't. And I kind of take a little bit of an issue with that, because I think everyone can come up with ideas. I think the difference for me is that I struggle to not come up with ideas. And sometimes that's a blessing and a curse. You know, the ideas just kind of tend to come really naturally to me. But it's not saying that everyone can't be creative or everyone can't come up with ideas. I think there is somewhere along the line, we've held this assumption that ideas are two things. Number one, they're reserved for some select group of special people, and only the deeply talented or creative can have good ideas. And the second one is that ideas come in this moment of insight, which is, just pops out of nowhere and boom, there's the idea. I take issue with the whole light bulb moment, because the light bulb, if you look in the history of it, was actually a series of ideas building on other ideas. And so now we use that as the symbol for creativity. And I think what ideas are a series and an accumulation over time that builds on the foundations of that before it and connects the dots in a new different way. And so I think the post you're talking about was this idea. I was having a conversation with a mutual friend, Michael Dixon, and he wrote a book called Everyday Creative. And in there, he has this idea that, he kind of unpacks it, which is a bit of a Steve Jobs kind of thought, that creativity is about connecting the dots. And he said, so if creativity is about connecting the dots, then curiosity is the art of collecting the dots. And I really loved that thought of like imagining going through life. And it resonated with me because I'm the learner, which is, imagine you've got this little bag, and all through conversations and experiences and learning, you're putting little dots in the bag. And then a couple of weeks later, I was having a conversation with Paul Fairweather for their podcast called Common Creative. And he said, oh, well, if curiosity is the art of collecting the dots, well, I think curation is the art of arranging them, kind of sequencing those dots in a way that's helpful for others. And so, of course, I had to respond to that and have some sort of input to the conversation. So I said, well, if curation is the art of arranging them, then I think collaboration is the art of sharing our dots. When we get into a room, your dots exchange with my dots, which allows us in the end, which is what creativity is for us to connect all of those dots in a new way that hasn't been done before.
Which is interesting in itself, right? Because I wonder, when you think about that concept, so you've got the three, you've got the connecting the dots.
Yep.
The
arranging.
Talk me through it again.
So we got collecting, which is the curiosity. Curating,
yeah.
which is like arranging.
Curating, yeah.
And collaborating, which is sharing.
Right. So you've got collecting, you've got arranging the dots, and then you've got the sharing of the dots. I wonder if we were to get curious about where our natural strength is, then whether that would lead on to identifying the gaps that you need to help actually find that next creative thing for your business. So, are you naturally a collector of dots, which as StrengthsFinder Gallups, maybe that's you. And if that's all you do, it's going to stay in its thing. Then there's the arranging of the dots. So who's doing that for you? Who are you sat with doing that? And then there's the bringing it together and actually doing something with it. I wonder if you were then to extend that thinking into teams, into leadership, into businesses, whether therein lies some insight as to where the gaps are for you to keep growing your business. What are your thoughts on that while you're thinking? Those of you that are watching online, if you have any questions for Shane, just fire away. I'm trying to keep track of the chat. Wonderful to see you all here online on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. We are currently talking about idea generation, which is a critical need for business owners and for leaders. But what Shane is suggesting is they don't happen as light bulb moments. And maybe if we think about idea generation more as this concept of connecting dots, curating those dots, and then rearranging those dots to make some magic happen, whether there's an opportunity there to find that gap in your market. So go for it, Shane. Your thoughts.
I mean, I love that extension of this into a business context or a leadership context, and identifying where in this process could I be strong, or where might I need to stretch in this space. So I think about, if we were to kind of map these to the questions I would ask is, when it comes to curiosity, it is about, do you have opportunity to learn, and do you have opportunity to ask great questions? And if you don't, what are the experiences you could engage in? And this is funny. I've used this example of a friend of mine years ago who was just an exceptional communicator. And I was driving him to the airport. He'd just spoken at an event. And he said to me, Shane, what books are you reading at the moment? And I said, oh, well, here's all these great books that I'm, trying to show off with, because I liked him. And he said to me, he goes, they seem very similar genre. And they're all kind of business leadership books. He's like, what have you read lately that's not in that genre? And I went, well, not a lot, because that's kind of not the space I'm in. And I said, well, what are you reading at the moment? He said, I'm reading a book about eagles right now. And I went, like, why? And are you interested in eagles? And he said, no. He said, but what I think I'm doing is I'm exposing myself to different genres and different learnings and different lessons. And I always wondered what it was about him that has this ability to kind of draw metaphor or story or illustration from different kind of spheres of life. And it's his commitment to getting exposure and experience outside of what is his normal domain. And so within this first space around curiosity, it's around where right now are you locked within a particular space or sphere that's not giving you the exposure that you need to get new opportunities to learn and grow. So maybe that's a business conversation that we could have in that first space. And then the second one around curation might be, I think curation ultimately is going to come down to the discipline of arranging your ideas and arranging that learning and that lesson. So when was the last time you sat down and captured your ideas and your thoughts and your lessons and your learnings? And in what way? Do you journal? Do you record them online? Do you get them out on paper in some particular way? Like, that would be the second question that I ask. And then the third one is around the collaboration, which is, who might I need to bring into this conversation to bring me a different perspective that I'm not seeing right now? So whether it's about experience, whether it's about discipline, or whether it's about people, like, where are the gaps that I'm missing right now that I might be losing an opportunity to ideate?
Yeah, I love that. Let's go into that business piece, because so many of the conversations I have are around, people naturally, maybe even unconsciously, end up sitting in status quo. It's like they're surrounding themselves with the same people, having the same conversations, having the same insight, that actually in this massively adaptive world that we are now living in, where we have no idea what the next 12 months, 2 years, 3 years are looking like, that transactional nature of trying to find an idea or make a decision as to what we do next is actually probably one of the most riskiest things we can do. We've actually got to be brave enough. I talk about being brave enough to tap into curiosity more, to learn how to connect dots differently, to trust your intuition, and to, most of all, when you make that decision, to have the ability to inspire other people to do the work that is needed. And I want to come on to your thoughts on communication linked with that in a second. But from your perspective, when you look at business, that ability to, you talk about, where do you get information from? What are you seeing? And I guess, what do you wish there was more of?
Oh my gosh, good question. What I'm seeing, and this is not new, but it's been amplified. I would say we're information rich and attention poor.
Yeah.
And we are, I guess, connection hungry, but meeting overloaded. So this is the kind of the tensions of the extremes that we're dealing with right now. We've got all this information, but we're struggling to kind of retain it all and bring it all in, because everything is competing for our attention. We want connection, but the avenues and the methods in which we're getting connection are wearing us out right now. So how do you deal with the kind of seemingly opposing forces of, I want more connection, but I want to see people less often? I've been saying to people lately, because, here in Melbourne, we've been fortunate to be able to start to see people again after the last 12 months and go out and have different kind of social events. And I've been saying to people, I'm not really match fit for socializing. Yet I want it, but I'm struggling to kind of get back to the pace that I was at prior to all of this. And so I guess what I'm noticing is that the things that worked for us before, in order to be able to create collaborative environments or to be able to build meaningful connection, isn't just about going and doing more of the same. We actually have to think about, what are some of the ways that we could do maybe the same thing in a different way, or look at it from a different perspective. And this is like the value of great ideas or ideation, is that we get to look at the same situation or same context, but look at it from a different view or a different angle and find a new way of doing something.
Yeah, that ability to almost get on that balcony and look in and get curious about, how could I do this differently? I was literally, just before we started, on a call with a client in Dallas who's got this, just, oh my God, it's so exciting, the business that she's creating. And the thing I said to her was, what are the questions that you're not asking yet that actually you need to be asking? Because by asking that question, potentially you're getting the answer that you're currently trying to seek. And that ability, and it's a bit of a mind, insert expletive, because it requires you to take that step back and go, what am I not asking right now? What is the question that I have not yet asked, that if I could find the question and then be brave enough to ask that question, potentially that's where the answer is that I am seeking.
You're so good at this. You're so good at this, because I remember, like, almost every time we're in a WhatsApp group together and we chat about things, and when we share the good things or the lessons or the wins that we've had, like, your immediate response is like, okay, let's get on the balcony and let's actually look at this and go, like, why did that work well, or why didn't that work well? And you're so good at asking that question. I was doing a workshop last week with some leaders, and it was around helping them become more curious and become more coach-like in the way that they lead. And the experiment that I gave them was, a lot of people say to me, well, what do I do if I don't know the answer? That's a lot of people's biggest fears, whether it's speaking in public or coaching, or like, what happens if I don't know the answer? And I reframed that and I said, what do you do when you do know the answer? How do you stop yourself from jumping in to give it and instead ask a question, which is kind of what you're touching on here. So if you think you have the answer, what would it look like to stop and go, what if I asked a question instead? Would it result in the same answer, or could I find a new way of looking at this context or this situation?
Yeah. Yeah, because when we jump in with the answer straight away, you're not actually creating the space for potentially something else to appear. You're literally shutting it down, which brings me on to what you talk about with the leadership gap, because I love this work that you do, and your passion around actually our job as leaders is to create exponential growth by unlocking that potential in others, by creating that remarkable leadership in others. To bring it back a second, what do you see as the biggest leadership gap right now?
There's a few things that I would say. What I think I've noticed has been the biggest challenge is that many of the things that get people promoted to leadership look very different to the expectations of a person who's in leadership. And that's a really hard transition for new leaders, and I say first-time leaders. First-time leaders is not just like you're brand new to leadership. I'm talking people who've been in leadership for years, but they're still in that first-time leadership role. That's a hard transition to make. And there's a bunch of transitions we're going to make. Let's use a couple of examples. Let's talk about creativity, because this is the space we're in. When you're on a team, what do we value from our team members? Well, we value contribution. And what we value is creativity and creative ideas, and that you would come to a meeting prepared with solutions rather than, questions, with answers rather than questions. And so we reward that. So someone brings a great idea to us and we go, that's fantastic. Let's celebrate that person. Now that person gets promoted into leadership and now they're leading a team. Well, how do you get your recognition and value as a leader? Well, I've always been promoted because of my creativity. And so what you do is you go to your team meeting and you bring your ideas, you bring your answers, you bring your solutions, and your team go, that's great, well done, good answer, but you don't create this collaborative environment. So now all of a sudden we've got to shift the space where I'm not the creative idea bringer, but now I'm the creative environment creator. And so my job is not to bring ideas, it's to bring out ideas. And that's a huge shift. And so that creates this leadership gap. And that happens in a number of different areas, which makes it really challenging for organizations.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you are passionate about is how we do connect and how we do communicate. So for those people that are listening that may be building their own businesses and they've got a vision, I know there's somebody that's already messaged me that has said, I need to go, but I want to rewatch this, that's passionate about the communication space, particularly amongst that millennial generation. Her work is, the millennials going into work are having to learn how to communicate. And at the same time, leaders in those organizations are having to learn how to communicate to unlock those ideas. So the question she asked me to ask you is, any tips on that? So from a millennial perspective, who has ideas and dreams, who's going into an organization, how they should communicate. And at the same time, if I put myself in the box, how I need to potentially change my communication so that we unlock this creativity, we collaborate better, we amplify how together we can move forward. What are your thoughts on that?
It's interesting because in so many ways, our context shapes our content, right? This is the nature of communication. So the environment and the context in which we both grew up in, we operate in, can shape how we communicate. So if you let's take a millennial workforce as an example, because they typically get the conversations about how do we best engage with you strange foreign person. You know what I mean? Like we're just this kind of anomaly in the generations, and they go, well, you're in the workforce, but I don't really understand you. And so how do we communicate in a way that cuts through and makes sense? But if you just take a step back and look at the context in which most of these people grew up in, they grew up pre-computers kind of space, pre-internet. Then they had internet, and then they had pre-phone, iPhone to iPhone to texting to so now all of a sudden they've come across all these different contexts. And so how would that show up in the way that you communicate? Well, they're used to, in the environment they're in, texting each other, which is short form. We grew up in the era of Twitter being limited to 140 characters. So you were taught to condense your ideas down into simple and simplified communication. Now, the big challenge is that can often show up as direct or blunt in a conversation. So someone responds to an email in a short, succinct way, and it's like, well, that's kind of a bit blunt and a bit direct. And that's content, right?
Yeah, you're reminding me of a conversation I've literally just had with my mom over the weekend, where she's going, I said, just text the kids. And she actually said, I've been texting them, and my eldest, Flint, doesn't respond, or it just says cool. And you are just like giving me the big aha moment as to why. And I went to her, it's okay. He's acknowledged, because he's spoken to me about the fact that you've been in touch, blah, 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 but he's not going to give you that paragraph conversation. And yeah, thank you. You've literally just given me, I might have to edit this bit out and send it to Mum so she understands why he's in one word answers.
It's a real place. And again, like I have those conversations. I have to, and this is, I think, always the balance, right? Because I don't think we should ever go, well, I'm going to adjust my entire leadership style because you grew up in a different context. I think it's open dialogue and conversation and understanding each person's context. So I don't text my mum short one-word text messages. I actually pick up the phone and I call her because I know she values conversation and she values hearing my voice and having those. And so again, it's this kind of give and take. But at the time, she texts me and she'll kind of give me short, she'll send me a photo or she'll just send me a couple of words. And I'm just like, I appreciate that. So it's not about kind of completely drastically changing your communication style. It's just understanding context and how that might be influencing the content.
Which makes it, do you think therefore it has got more complex than ever before because we've got so many different generations in the workplace? Equally, we haven't got that traditional, you're a leader when you're this age and you're running this business. We've got running incredible businesses at young ages. We've got young leaders having huge responsibility in organizations. So do you think just the fact we need to own that actually is more complex than ever before, but it's up to each and every single one of us to understand the context in which you're trying to communicate? That's that ownership piece to actually, if we go back on the balcony, our aim is to get somewhere. Our aim is to find a new idea, to collaborate better, to move forward in the direction. So it is actually complex. And so we've all got to put in some work.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, complex, yes, not necessarily complicated. And I think that's the distinction between this, right? Is that once you understand the system, you can make sense of the communication. So it is complex because there's so many different generations and moving parts and experiences and learning. I think this almost links back to the start of our conversation around curiosity, right? If I enter a conversation through curiosity, my desire is to understand your context. And if my desire is to understand your context, I can engage better in your communication.
Yeah, I love that. Hey, you just said something. I love the way our conversation is like going so down rabbit holes. I knew it would do this. I did warn you, there's no agenda. We're just having a conversation. But what you just said there about the difference between complex and not complicated. I was doing my run this morning with my running partner, and we were talking about a particular business owner. And she made this comment about, she actually said, this person is incredibly articulate, but the reason they're not cutting through is because they can't articulate. So again, it's that, so really, really smart, awesome ideas. There's no doubt this person knows their stuff. So can talk. She literally said she's talking, and I can know she's articulate, but her ability to articulate for me to understand is really tricky. Comments on that?
I love that distinction, because it's, funnily enough, this is similar to a conversation I had on Instagram. I put out a Ask Me Anything on Instagram, and someone asked the question of me, how do you balance the tension between creativity and clarity? And he was like, in communication, how do you be creative and, get it across in an expressive and a creative way, whilst at the same time making it clear? And my response to that is I think both are really important. But if I was to put one as a preference in terms of the sequencing, I would put clarity first and creativity. And the reason why is when I put creativity first, I often get caught up trying to be clever. And then as a result of trying to be clever, I don't become clear. Whereas if I become clear, then I can communicate it in a way that's creative. And so again, this is this articulate, which is like, I might have the words to be able to communicate it in a creative way, but I'm not sure it's clear and I haven't got clarity yet. And I said to someone recently, I think, and I wrote about it in my book, which is if we're going to start with something, start with clarity and finish with simplicity. And I don't think you can get to simplicity until you've fully got clarity. So this is kind of the articulated concept, which is how can I make sure that I'm extremely clear on what it is that I want to say? And then what would it look like to say that in the most simple way possible? And I mean, your experience with this is, you know, whether it's communicating it to a child or whether it's communicating it to like an audience that doesn't know your subject matter expertise, you learn over time, right? Like, how have you found that experience of taking your message and you communicate all different platforms and contexts? How do you do that?
Yeah. So, Charlotte, I hope you were here because I asked the question on your behalf. She's saying, absolutely loving this conversation. Arthur, very well articulated. Hey, if you're listening in and you've got a question for Shane, fire away and I will ask him. This guy gets paid thousands to advise leadership teams around the world. He's an internationally in-demand keynote speaker, author of an incredible book called Lead the Room, and you've got him for free this morning. So if you've got any questions, fire away. Where was I going to go with the, here's my question. Yeah, so I've got two parts to it. One, how do you, from your perspective, think that what do you have to do to get clarity? And I'll tell you where that's coming from. Probably like yourself, I come across a lot of very smart people, smart thought leaders, smart business owners, great ideas, but much like my friend this morning, that inability to actually articulate is letting them down. So they don't get the leads, they don't get the conversion, their business isn't growing because people are going, oh my God, I'm just totally lost in this. And I think, you know, I know one of my strengths is I'm quite a simple thinker, or maybe I'm not, I'm a simple speaker. And so that ability to cut through is easier. But from your perspective, what advice would you give to people to get that clarity piece? And the second part of my question, that was it. I'm now, because I can't write notes and look at you at the same time. The second part of my question is, what are the unconscious things getting in the way that are stopping us from getting clear? What's really getting in the way that stops us from taking that time to actually simplify our communication, simplify our messaging? From my point, it's this thing where I talk about, you know, the complexity that people have put around networking, for example. I go, it's just connection. It's just human beings to human beings connecting. Why are you so scared of connecting as a human being? Why are you almost vomiting in your mouth at the thought of going to a networking event when simply you just go, hey, how are you? How did you get here today? Oh, loving what you're wearing. What is it that is getting in our way? So 2 parts to the question. And if you're still on listening, or you're listening to this as part of the replay, again, if you're listening to it as part of the replay, just type replay in the comments. If you've got a question for Shane and you're watching in the replay, I'll make sure he gets that question so he can respond. But yeah, so some tips of getting clarity. And then number 2, what's getting in the way? Love to know those people listening what they think. But let's go to you, Shane.
Oh my gosh, they are such big questions, Janine. I love, this is why I love having conversations with you. Someone asked me recently, how long does it take you to prepare to speak? And I would say, well, it depends on how I want to speak. I would say if I want to speak with confidence, hours. If I want to speak with clarity, days. And if I want to speak with conviction, years. And I think the reason why I put that in that sequencing is because the experience that I've had leads me to, I guess, a pretty fortunate ability to be able to say, hey, could you speak on this topic? Yeah, give me 20 minutes. I'll get my ideas together and let's chat about it. And I can jump up and pretty much come across confident on a stage. I don't know that it would be entirely clear to the extent that I could have if I'd had a few days of preparation and digging deep and really discovering the essence of that message. And again, the conviction that comes with it, you can't build without a life that has lived out the experience of that. And so that's kind of the progression that I would say. And I think clarity is effort and it takes time to do that. And It reminds me kind of a few years ago when we were able to travel. We were in Florence in Italy, and we were doing the tour where we went through and we saw the statue of David, and we went through and saw all the sculptures. And the tour guide was telling us a story about Michelangelo. And he said, you know, Michelangelo has this famous quote, which is that he believes that the sculpture was already in the stone, and it was his job to remove everything that was unnecessary to reveal it. And I think that for me has always been the journey of clarity. The journey of clarity is, what can I do to remove everything that is unnecessary or gets in the way of the most important thing that needs to be communicated or shared right now? So what gets in the way of that? I think, number one, we try to add rather than we try to take. And we try to get clarity by adding more rather than by stripping back. And it kind of goes back to a metaphor I used at the start of last year, which is like when you sharpen a pencil, that, you know, the sharpening is not necessarily about adding, it's by actually stripping away and removing. And so like whether you're a business owner, whether you're a leader, the question that I would constantly be asking myself is, if I want greater clarity, what do I need to start removing and stripping away, rather than how do I add more meetings, add more conversations, add more content to this conversation? And so what gets in the way, I think, is we try to add. And number two, we sit in a room with our chisel in our hand and we go, I'm waiting for the idea to strike, rather than taking action and starting to remove or starting to chisel away and do the work. So I think we've kind of got mutual mentors who talk about the idea of that clarity or action precedes clarity, which is this, you know, go out and start and remove and strip away and reveal the idea or the sculpture or the message, rather than trying to find a way to sit in a room and wait for it to strike you.
I love that. And Mike Perry, so my very good friend Mike Perry has joined us online. Wonderful to see you. Mike is based over in the US, and Mike and I were students together at Harvard, so it's fabulous that you're here, Mike. We need to connect. He's actually just written hours, days, years. That's good. Just say it again for anyone that needs it.
Yeah,
what you
so
said
if I want to speak with confidence, hours. If I'd like to speak with clarity, days. If I want to speak with conviction, years.
Yeah, love it, love it, love it. And that concept of the fact that as human beings, we have this desire to add versus actually maybe the craftsmanship and the mastery of how we connect, how we build our businesses, how we influence, how we inspire, how we create is actually the mastery of what we take away. And if I for a second put that into the context of communication and leadership, you know, how many times have we seen that where I know I have been in meetings before, even meetings where I'm getting feedback or those beautiful not 360-degree reviews where you're almost going, what are you trying to say? What are you trying to say? What are you trying to say? And actually we overthink things. And maybe if we just let all those barriers go, the opportunity would be great. Mike Perry and I have a mutual friend, Ron Harvey. I've shared his story. Actually, Mike was in Be Brilliant too. I shared his story in Be Brilliant. But our mutual friend, Ron Harvey, talks about the fact that you have nothing to prove, nothing to lose, and yet everything to gain. So nothing to prove, nothing to use, and yet everything to gain. And I was again in a mentoring session yesterday talking to a client, and they were so caught up in what their message was going to be with this particular negotiation. I just went, stop. You've got nothing to prove. You've proved your business is absolutely capable of achieving more. You've got nothing to lose by having an honest conversation. And yet the other side of having an honest, clear conversation where you're laying your cards on the table is potentially you've got everything to gain.
What do you think? What are your thoughts as to why we have this desire to want to prove ourselves? Because it shows up, right? Shows up in creativity. I have to have the best ideas. It shows up in feedback. I have to, give the best contribution or make the best contribution. So where's this desire to want to prove something come from for you?
I think it comes from? I think it's an inner fear. And that fear is different for all of us. So it could be a fear of looking stupid. So your ego is taking over and you fill the void with words and statements, and a bit like we were talking about earlier, you share the answer when it might not be the right answer. I think it's a fear of being out of control, of not necessarily having the answers. So again, your bravado takes over, and again, we've seen this all the time. You see people where they walk into the room with bravado and they leave and nothing's actually happened. So there's that fear. And I think for some people, it is this, it's a vulnerability place. So it takes a lot, I reckon, to just be present. It takes a lot to be simple, to simplify. And it takes an incredible amount of craftsmanship to stay really focused and in your lane. And if you look at those successful business owners, if you look at those amazing creatives, if you look at those incredible sports people, they're simple, really. The best businesses are the simple businesses. The best leaders are the ones where you've got absolute clarity on what to expect every moment you walk into a room. The most incredible mentors are the ones that have always been honest with you and told you where you're at. The best sports people have got a laser sharp focus where they are simply hitting the ball backwards and forwards, learning the rocks, whatever it may be. And I think we fill ourselves with so much stuff that we actually can't be clear. An example to bring it back to daily life, we've almost gone through a whole load of years where we've been told to be really productive. And that productivity presenting itself as an example of jam-packing every single moment with stuff. So get in the car, put a podcast on, run with the podcast on, stuff. Actually, my argument is we need to strip that stuff back. Like maybe if you ran without a podcast on, the idea would come. Maybe if you drove from A to B with no noise, the idea would come. So much like you're talking around we have to take away versus add, I think you can use the same concept for ourselves and our ability to grow, but our fear of conforming, of doing what we're supposed to do, of having read the top 10 books, of being on top of Harvard Business Review comments, of listening to that podcast, of adding, of being busy is actually stopping that simplicity. So I think what you're saying can relate to so many different areas. Mike's added here, pride, ego, there's a great deal of humility required to take away versus add. There's genius in simplicity.
And there is. I think there's something about when you can hear a person distill an idea or a thought down to its essence, you don't look at that person and go, well, that person's, just simple. You go, that person is elegant, and that person has this ability to kind of take complexity and distill it down to simplicity. And we always admire that. We don't look at that to be lesser in conversations. And your thought around just the continual cramming of information and ideas and removing some of the margins in our life, I would suggest is in the ideation process, one of the biggest barriers to great ideas coming is that, yes, there's this process of curation and collection and exploration, but it's only to a certain point when eventually you have to sit down and make sense of that. And to do that, you need space and you need margin. And I think about it much like James Webb Young wrote a book called A Technique for Producing Ideas. And he talked about it like a kaleidoscope. And in your experiences are like putting glass into the kaleidoscope. And then he said, but you eventually need to sit down and twist the kaleidoscope and look at it through different patterns and different lenses. And most of the time we don't make that time or space to sit down and look at the patterns. And so we just collect more and more glass and we've got these ugly kind of patterns and nothing's emerging. And so the question that I often ask people at the moment, especially in the world that we're living in now, where meetings go right to the time and we've got no margins left, is I would ask the question of how could you schedule more time than you need or finish earlier than you planned so you could break more often than you do? Because the challenge is the more that we put in the middle of our life and our career and our business, the less we have at the edges. And I think when we remove the edges, we remove the space for creativity and ideation and curiosity and contemplation. And I think that's dangerous.
Yeah. I do too. Oh my God, I reckon we could have a talkathon all day. Maybe that might be one of my second half challenges of staying live streaming all day and just having awesome conversations. Shane, what is your, well, first of all, I've got your book behind me, but I can't reach over. Have you got a copy of your book right there? Oh, Julie Doyle, hello, my friend. Needing space and margin to create it. Love it. So Shane, hold it up again. Lead the room. Awesome book. Shane is, you can find him on every single social media channel. As I said, part of this monthly series that I'm doing, It's Who You Know series, is bringing to you people that know me, some of the people that I know, because I am passionate about the opportunity, the magic that is created when we connect in the way I connect, and when we are open to exploring the opportunity to collaborate, and collaborate from the perspective not just of doing stuff, but of actually letting our brains explode with ideas. It's awesome. For those of you that have joined me online, I've loved our conversation. Please reach out to Shane. Shane, your wrap up couple of sentences. You can run round and deep and wherever. What's your final message to people that are listening in?
Well, firstly, it's again for me, it's a resubscribe to everything that you are, Janine. I love it, and I'm super grateful for the opportunity to know you and to be able to do this. I just think at the end of this, what is deeply important is if we want to be creative, then we need the space to get the clarity that we need. And ultimately, that's what it comes down to me is create space intentionally to get clarity, and it will absolutely transform the way that you lead and the way that you do your business.
Shane, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, everyone who is online. Mike Perry, I think we need to get you on this live stream one day, my friend. I've no idea what time it is over where you're at. Arthur, thanks for joining us. Charlotte Lane, Julie Doyle, you are all awesome. Anyone that's Shrimmy, if you're still here, anyone that is listening to the replay, make sure you say hi. And in about a month's time, I'll be back again introducing you to another of my friends. Thank you so much, Shane, for gifting your time. Always such a pleasure to talk to you. My brain is spinning. I need to grab a notebook and start writing. Have a truly awesome day. And once again, thank you so much.
Appreciate you.
You too.